Interview of Mr. Harold John von Hasseln, 22 March 2001, Hilton Head Island. Interviewer is Lieutenant Colonel Robert von Hasseln, and videographer is Eric von Hasseln. Dad, tell me where were you born and when?
I was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1922.
And where in Brooklyn? Where in Brooklyn were you born? Where in Brooklyn?
Oh, I was born in East New York, Brooklyn. We moved into Flatbush shortly thereafter.
Now, what was it like growing up in Brooklyn in those days? What did you do for fun, and how did you spend your time?
Well, besides going to school, we generally played street ball. You know, we played touch football and stickball and flat ball, all everything in the street, basically.
And what did your father do?
My father was an accountant for a paint company, but he did more than that. He invented a poisonous paint for the bottom of boats to take the barnacles off.
And your mother?
My mother was a bookkeeper before she married, and she was a whiz with numbers.
Now, what high school did you go to?
Went to Brooklyn Technical High School.
And when did you graduate?
January 1940.
Okay. And what did you do between 1940 and the time you went into the service?
Went to Georgia Tech.
Why Georgia Tech?
Well, it was a reasonable cost, and it was away from home, and it was a technical college.
And you wanted to be an engineer?
I wanted to be a mechanical engineer.
So, when was it when you first attended the college? 1940 or 1941?
1940, September.
Mm-hmm. And how was that? How did you find going to school in Atlanta? How was it?
It was fine. It was very good.
Mm-hmm.
It was the type of school that they told you what you had to do for 4 years, so you didn't have to make any choices. You had a curriculum and you stuck to it.
Now, do you remember where you were when Pearl Harbor was bombed?
I was in a movie house watching a movie.
Yeah, which movie?
Oh, that I don't remember.
And what was your reaction at the time?
What an awful thing, I guess. That was it. The whole fraternity house stayed up all night getting the news reports because we all knew that it was going to have a big effect on us individually.
And now, when did you come to be in the service?
Well, that's a long story. I applied for senior ROTC, and with Pearl Harbor and the war, the rules were made that in order to be accepted for senior ROTC, you had to enlist in the Enlisted Reserve Corps, which I did. And because the war was on, the school went on a 3-semester-a-year basis. So there'd be no summer vacations as we used to know them. We got 3 semesters a year, which meant that in 2 years we did 3 years' work.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of graduating in June of 1944, I graduated in October of 1943. In the beginning of my senior year, I was called to active duty as an enlisted reservist. And at the end of my first semester, in my senior year, the Army ordered us to OCS. and we were quite disappointed because here we were 4 months from graduating and the Army was putting us into full service. So we went home, but before we reported to OCS, where we were supposed to, we got a telegram saying if we wanted to go back to school for the last 4 months at our own expense, we could. So every member of my class chose to go back to school, and we all graduated and went on to OCS. Sad part of it, in our way of thinking at the time, was we had traded not having 6 weeks of summer camp to get our commission for 17 weeks of OCS to get our commission. But I was commissioned in March of 1944. March 17th.
And where was that?
Fort Monroe.
And that you were there because you were in the...
Coast Artillery OCS.
How did you end up in the Coast Artillery?
There were about 36 of us in the artillery, Coast Artillery, ROTC at Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech had Coast Artillery, Infantry, Signal Corps, and Ordnance. And when it came time for us to go to OCS, they had requirement for 6 Coast Artillery School candidates and 30 anti-aircraft, Camp Davis, OCS. So they started, take every 5th or every 6th fella and send them off to Coast Artillery. And I was one that went to Coast Artillery. But I was the last class of the Coast Artillery OCS.
And what did you expect you'd be doing when you went to Coast Artillery OCS? What did you expect your duties would be?
Thought I'd be a battery officer at some post.
And how was OCS at
Well, it was very interesting and very nice. It was, I don't think it was as rough as Camp Davis, from what I learned later, but it was a good, interesting course, and we fired a lot of big guns and learned a lot about artillery.
After you were commissioned, where were you sent?
When I was commissioned, the Army, in its wisdom, said, here's an engineer, doesn't matter if he's mechanical, let's send him to radar school and make him a radar officer. So I reported back to Fort Monroe for a 4-month radar course. And when I graduated, I had a MOS as a radar tactical and maintenance officer. And the interesting part of that was the directives from the headquarters of the Army said anybody with that MOS could not be assigned to any job other than radar. And there were no jobs for me to be assigned to. So for over a year, I stayed at Fort Monroe, Virginia, serving as motor pool officer for the school, and the best job was a term of being radar test officer for the Coast Artillery Board, testing new radars for see if they were suitable for Coast Artillery. But these were all non-assigned jobs, so there was no chance for promotion or anything like that. It was filling in time. Did it for a year and a half.
And then what happened after that?
I was assigned to Fort Moultrie, South Carolina, as Harbor Defense Radar Officer.
And what were your duties there?
I had you might say, a platoon of men and 6 radar sets to keep operating. 5 of them were fire control radars, and 1 of them was a surveillance radar. And I mention a surveillance radar because we did something that I think was the first, that I had 6 Navy petty officers assigned to me who controlled the harbor entrance with signal lights.
Mm-hmm.
And we also used those 6 sailors and my men and a surveillance radar to establish an air-sea rescue operation in the southeast United States.
Did you ever have to, did you actually ever have to use it for a radar rescue operation?
Oh, yes.
Can you tell us about that?
I can't. I don't remember now, but I know we did.
Okay. And then what happened, what other duties did you have as a harbor defense officer?
Oh. When I first arrived, I was the junior officer. Oh. I arrived there and was promoted to first lieutenant the day I arrived. And I was still a junior officer on the post. It was a small post. There was only about 21 officers on the post. And we had a meeting of the officers club within a week of my arrival. And being the newest and most junior, I was made club officer. And that was a rather interesting job for 2 reasons. One, most of us knew that we were going to be separated from the Army within 6 to 8 months. And there was $50,000, $60,000 in the club fund. So it was voted that we should try to spend all of that money rather than leave it for the regular Army. And so as club officer, I threw party after party after party. And the interesting thing about that was that when I left the post for Dick's separation, the colonel congratulated me, and he said, and I expect he was going to congratulate me about the air-sea rescue. He says, and never has an officers club been run so well. And that was his final remarks to me. The other interesting part about being club officer at that time was a squall came up one Sunday afternoon, and a Liberty ship dragged anchor up the river and knocked out 100 feet of the bridge from Charleston to Mount Pleasant, which was our only way of getting back and forth from the post to Charleston. So how do you get musicians over to the post for parties?
Mm-hmm.
Well, we worked a deal with the commander of an LSM to come over on Saturday nights and bring our band over, and we gave him free reign of the club, and we have our orchestra there, which was interesting. Everybody couldn't figure out how we got an orchestra across the bridge. But it was through the Navy's good graces that we did.
Mm-hmm. And after that?
Well, the other interesting thing about that post was that I was made defense counsel for General Court, mm-hmm. and served on 3 or 4 trials during my short period there.
And what was that like?
Say again?
What was it like being a defense counsel?
Well, very interesting. Very, very interesting. The most interesting case I had was the MPs picked up a soldier in Charleston in the trailer park outside the Charleston Navy Yard and arrested him for rape because he was running down the street. It turns out the soldier had a borderline IQ and shouldn't have really been put in the Army. But he was arrested and found guilty and sentenced to a long term. But in review, they decided to have a retrial, and that's when I got him. And I went into the Navy Yard to the trailer park and found the girl that said she was raped by him. And I asked her how she knew it was he, because it was dark. And she says, well, I reached up and pulled the light on. Well, the light was about 4 feet above her bed, and she was lying in her bed when she reached the light. And she couldn't demonstrate that she could reach the light. So net result, the fellow got off with time served, which was, I felt very good. And we had another case of a warrant officer who took a car without permission into Charleston and hit a school bus.
Mm-hmm.
And the colonel wanted to lower the boom on him, but the warrant officer was very smart, and he got a Louisiana Supreme Court justice from the Judge Advocate Generals to defend him, and I served as his assistant, and that was interesting to see how a real professional handled it. So that's basically the story of Fort Moultrie.
Mm-hmm. From there you went to Fort Dix?
For separation.
And then what happened?
Well, I went to work, and went to do the thing I went to school to learn to do. That was to be a machine designer. And I designed production machines for Western Electric for 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
But then the lure of electronics, which I picked up as a radar officer, was too strong, and I went to work for Sperry Gyroscope Company as a product engineer on first airborne radar for missile control. And that started me off on a long track through all sorts of jobs in Sperry Gyroscope. And in the meantime, or at the same time as I was doing that, I was in the active reserves, and I got a questionnaire after about 3 years in the active reserves, during which there were 6 of us who put together a battalion. But when I left, it was about 150 strong. It was not too easy to get people. I got this questionnaire, and it said, how soon, if there's an immobilization, can you join the active army? And I put down a long date, which my company indicated they backed me up on it because I was working on a secret project for the Navy. So they transferred me, the Army, without telling me, transferred me from the active reserve to the inactive, turned me down for promotion because I was in the inactive reserve, and then asked me to sign some papers for a lifetime commission rather than a 5-year commission. I delayed, and got it there a day late, and so I was discharged because I had no status for a day. And that was the end of my Army career. But I worked for 30 more years with the Air Force and the Navy, so I wasn't far from the military.
What other kind of projects did you work on at Sperry?
What other projects?
At Sperry.
The first one was, of course, the Sparrow missile. I did the airborne radar for that. And then the next job was the navigation and fire control system for the B-58 supersonic bomber. We outfitted 2 squadrons with that equipment. And then the next, I'm only giving you the big ones, these little ones here. The next one was the fire control system for the Oliver Hazard Perry class of frigates. This was an interesting job from the viewpoint that it was originally developed by a Dutch outfit, and we had to convert it to American dimensional techniques, and there was quite a bit of problems with that. This was at the time when Congress was saying we're going to go to the metric system, and I expected we would build it to the metric, but no, the Navy wanted it built to the American system, and we still haven't. That's about 30 years ago, 20, 30 years ago, and we still haven't gone to the metric system. But it was very an interesting job, and had a lot of troubles with one portion of it. And after that, I worked on replenishing radars on the dew line. And then on a new system for the FAA, and a new system for the weather prediction. That's the main ones, but there's a lot of in-between ones.
Now, when you first got out of the service, where did you live?
When I first got out of the service, I had to live with my mother in Brooklyn, even though I was married, because there was no housing available unless you wanted to pay $5,000 under the table, which I refused to do. So even though I was working in New Jersey, I applied for housing in a new department complex in Manhattan that Metropolitan Life Insurance was putting up, called Stuyvesant Town. And I lived there for 4 years, and then my first son was born, and we moved to Farmingdale. By that time I had changed jobs and went to work for Sperry in Great Neck on Long Island, and I moved to Farmingdale, Long Island.
And then, so what was it like living in Stuyvesant Town? Stuyvesant Town had just been built. You were
Oh yeah, it was a brand new building, very nice, nice size apartments. A great location for me because I could get a subway over to Journal Square and a bus from Journal Square to the plant. Or I could take a bus to the docks and take a ferry over to Cortlandt Street, and then a subway back to, so it wasn't too bad. When I lived in Brooklyn and worked for West Electric, it was an hour and a half trip each way. That was rough.
And most of the people who were living in Stuyvesant Town then were returning veterans?
Yeah, that was pretty much a requirement.
Did that make it kind of different living experience than maybe living in Brooklyn or somewhere else?
Oh, I think so. Brought us all closer together. Same thing true when I moved to Farmingdale, almost everybody in the neighborhood was a returning veteran, and we had a camaraderie, and we had street parties and things like that.
Now, when you first moved to Long Island was still very rural. Long Island was very rural when you moved to it.
Yes, a lot of potato fields and things like that.
And then it started to change?
Oh, yeah. Potato fields disappeared into, Levittown was a good example. But that was great for the returning veterans, because those houses only cost, I think, $7,000 in the first sale. And not all the veterans had a lot of money. You didn't get too most rich on $50 a month, which I think was the going rate for a private.
So how would you say Farmingdale changed during the years that you were there?
Well, fortunately, it didn't change too much. Farmingdale was an old established town that was built in the basically in the 1800s. But, so it was fairly well established with its own Main Street and whatnot, but of course, houses went up all around it, but the village was only a mile square, so there wasn't too much room to build. And the big change that came along well after the 1990s was the three businesses that kept a lot of people busy in Farmingdale was Grumman Aircraft, Republic Aircraft, and Sperry Gyroscope, and they're about all gone now.
And then after that you moved to Hilton Head Island?
Moved to Hilton Head Island.
Why did you pick Farmingdale originally?
That was an accident. I saw an ad for a house for rent in Bethpage. So we drove out there to see what it looked like, and we didn't like it. And in coming back, I took a wrong turn and ended up in the northwest corner of Farmingdale. And there was a bunch of houses going up, not too many, but, and they had two houses open for inspection. We went in and we liked them, and picked the corner lot that we wanted, and bought the house right then and there. That was it. We didn't spend much time looking. I'm very happy in that house.
And how about Hilton Head Island? How did you pick Hilton Head Island? How did you come to live in Hilton Head Island?
A friend of mine moved to Hilton Head Island, and I came down to visit, and I just loved the area. I mean, it's a very pretty area. And I was tired of the weather in Long Island, the taxes in Long Island, and the crowded roads in Long Island. So I got to come down here.
Yeah, you were married during the war? You got married during the war?
Got married 4 days after I was commissioned.
And how did you meet your wife?
She lived in Atlanta, and my fraternity brother knew her and introduced us.
And you have any children?
3.
All right, so we were talking, you had 3 children?
3 children.
And they were?
Stephen, Robert, and Laura.
And where are they now?
Stephen lives in Coral Springs, Florida. Robert lives in Cohoes, New York. And Laura lives outside of Aspen, Colorado, a little town called Basalt.
And what does she do?
She has 2 stores called Little Sport, which specialize in sports clothes for children, for skiing and things like that, and toys for children.
And she has children?
She has 3 children, 3 girls.
And Stephen, what does he do?
Stephen's job is hard to describe. His official title is security manager for a company called Answers. That's the answer to a question. And he's also project manager for putting up new facilities. And he's in a very fast-growing company, an interesting situation in that when you buy a computer from a company, they give you a telephone number to call if you have problems or want help. And that number they give you is not the number of the company that built the computer, but it's the number of Steve's company. And they have well over 100 people who do nothing but answer telephones 24 hours a day for people who are having trouble with their computers.
Well, let's go back now. You were married 4 days after you were commissioned.
Yeah.
And you had met your wife in Atlanta?
That's right.
How did you meet your wife?
At a party that the fraternity house gave.
And how come you didn't live in the South after the war?
I didn't care for the South as a place to live. And one of the reasons for that was the treatment of the blacks. And it was sort of highlighted to me by my son, Stephen, who, when he was about 4 years old, we were touring the railroad yards in Atlanta because one of my wife's uncles was master mechanic for the Southern Railroad. And Steve kept seeing these signs, black only or white only, and he couldn't understand why drinking fountains were relegated to black or white, or the bathrooms were. To his mind, he just didn't understand it. And of course, I hated the idea on the bus that a black person would have to get up and give a white person a seat.
And how did your wife feel about that?
Same way, even though she was born in the South.
And did you and your wife get involved in any community affairs when you were living on Long Island? Were you involved in any kind of community affairs?
In the South?
No, when you lived on Long Island.
I don't know whether they call them community affairs. I was a member of the Lions Club, which did a lot. I also served for a short period of time as an auxiliary policeman.
And what was the, what did you do as an auxiliary policeman? When was that?
That was shortly after I moved to Farmingdale. It was a frustrating experience. We wanted to help the police department, but at that time they wouldn't allow us to do anything because there was no insurance to cover auxiliary policemen. So it became a frustrating experience, which I gave up after a year or two.
Did that have anything to do with civil defense?
No.
No, let's go back and talk about a couple of things. in no particular order, the reserve unit that you were with. The reserve unit after
Yes.
the war? That was an anti-aircraft artillery unit?
Well, again, nothing is straightforward here. We were a Coast Artillery Regiment right after the war, and if I remember right, we were the 313th Coast Artillery Regiment, Harbor Defense Regiment. And the Army, realizing that the airplane made Coast Artillery defunct, it couldn't work anymore, transferred us all into anti-aircraft and made us a battalion. And gave us, since we were used to big guns, they designated us a 120 millimeter anti-aircraft gun. We never got to see a 120 millimeter gun because every time we went to summer camp, all we had were 90 millimeter guns, which we fired. But we were designated at 120 millimeter.
And where was the unit stationed?
It was stationed at Fort Tilden, Rockaway,
And how often would you drill with the unit?
once a week.
Was that an evening, one evening a week?
In the middle of the week?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was like a Tuesday night.
And what would you do on a typical Tuesday night?
Well, what I did, I was S2 for the battalion, and I held classes in cryptography, and I had some of the coding machines there to teach them how to use to encode and decode. And as a secondary duty, I was a radar officer again. I couldn't get away from that. And so I trained crews on how to operate the SCR 584 radar.
Did you get a lot done on a Tuesday night? Was it possible to do training on a Tuesday night?
Yeah. I could, to do the training on the radars, I made a deal with the National Guard regiment that had an SCR 584, and while I couldn't radiate, I could show them how to raise and lower the antenna and what, give them hands-on instruction, so that when we got to Camp Edwards, where we did our summer training, it wasn't all strange to them, and we were able to have some good shoots out there with using the radar and 4 90-millimeter guns.
Mm-hmm. And what was that summer camp like in those days? What did you do during summer camp? Would you go by convoy to Camp Edwards, or did you take a train?
I took a train. It was a great place to have a summer camp because it was very close to Hyannis, which is a very active part of Cape Cod. And then for shooting, we went up to Wellfleet, which is just outside of Provincetown, which is a swinging place, you might call it. Lots of music and stuff.
Did you get a lot of time off where you could enjoy some of the area, or?
Oh yeah, mostly at night.
Do you remember any particular characters in your unit, or did you have any friends in the when you were up at summer camp?
Any friends in where?
Did you go out with a particular group of guys, or?
Oh yeah. Mainly the fellas that we were in the battalion when we were formed, There was about 3 captains and myself would go out all the time. And the colonel was a hell of a good guy too. He'd have us over to his house if we shot the target down for drinks and things. It was an interesting.
Were most of the guys who were officers with you also World War II veterans?
They were all were.
Okay, let's go back and talk about World War II for a minute. Was there a time when you were told by the Army that you were not going to be commissioned, but instead you were going to be an enlisted man?
No. They always told us that we had to join the enlisted reserve corps because the Army had experience training the soldiers, training people in senior ROTC, and then some of the people were going out and hiring out to companies, the defense work. And when it came time for them to be ordered to active duty as second lieutenants, they had deferments because of the defense work, and they didn't want that to happen anymore. So if we were in the enlisted reserve, there was no chance of getting a deferment. You were in already. So we all became members of the enlisted reserve corps. It was interesting. They didn't give us any warning. They told us that on Thursday afternoon to be ready to go to Fort McPherson outside of Atlanta for induction into active duty. To bring a toilet kit with you and a change of underwear or something like that, and that was it.
And where did you expect to be going from there?
Back to school. Because that was the deal. That was just to protect our bodies from not getting out of the Army. And so we went to school, and then they decided to send us to OCS at the end of our first semester of senior year, which I'd said before. But then they reneged and sent us on to finish school, which was helpful.
Was there a time when you were alerted that you might be deployed overseas?
Yes, yes.
What happened then?
I was on standby for early warning radar. The concept was I take a platoon-sized group of people and a surveillance radar and set it up on a unoccupied island in the Pacific to monitor the movement of the Japs. So, and why those jobs weren't open and why I had to wait for an assignment was that the Navy kept taking the job on. And so all of a sudden the Navy wasn't taking on a couple of the islands, and we got alerted to head for California. So I rushed around and got my will and power of attorney all set, and got ready to ship my wife back to Atlanta. And the morning I was to leave, the word came in that the Navy had taken those islands again. So relax, and I was never alerted again.
And what were you thinking at the time? I mean, you thought you...
I felt that, this was right. I had been trained and I was ready.
Now, was there an incident where you and your wife were running to a ferry and she slipped?
Yeah, yeah.
What happened then?
Well, I told you before that the bridge had 100 feet knocked out of it, so the only way we could get back and forth was we converted a Army mine layer into like a shuttle boat. And it had, I don't know the Navy term, but the walls on the side of the ship were about 3 feet off the deck. And the gangplank came up to the top of that wall, and then there was a few steps down to the deck. And my wife and I were leaving on leave, and we were late, and the boat was about ready to depart. And so we came running up the gangplank, my wife in advance. It so happened that there was a group of Africa Corps prisoners on the tail end of the boat, and they watched us. And as my wife got to the top of the the gangplank, she slipped and fell. And this big Africa Korps guy stepped forward and caught her in his arms, turned, clicked his heels, and said, "Yours, Herr Leutnant?" And stood. Because I said, "Ja, danke."
And was there another incident when you were officer of the day where you had a problem with a sergeant?
Oh, yeah.
What was that about?
I was officer of the day, and as officer of the day, you generally see the first movie. And I was enjoying a movie, and one of the MPs came up and said, "You need it back at the guardhouse." And I got back to the guardhouse, and there was these two women just reeking of alcohol. And this one woman said, "My husband just stabbed me, and I want to press charges and have him arrested. And he stabbed me in the right buttock. You want to see it?" I said, "No, I don't want to see it. I'm going to call the OD at the hospital. We have a nice hospital on base." And I said, "I'm sending a woman down to you. I'd like you to verify that she was stabbed and to sew it up, or do whatever you think is necessary." So we sent her down with a couple of MPs, and they took care of her down there, and he called me and said, "Yeah, she's got a stab wound all right." And I took so many stitches to do it. So he came to trial, and because I was the arresting officer, I couldn't be defense counsel. So I became a witness. And the only witness there, I made her sign that she wanted him charged with this, that he did stab her and she wanted him charged. Because I figured she was drunk and she wouldn't remember. I was the only witness that could remember what happened that day. And what happened was the fellow who was the defense counsel was very smart. He found out somewhere that she and her girlfriend wanted to form a house of prostitution and make some money before they closed the post. And he objected to it, and in the argument he picked up a knife and slashed her. And she figured he'd go away for 6 months or something, and they could get started. But when my defense counsel told him that he was facing 10 years, she couldn't remember anything. So it so happened that while I was the arresting officer, I was also OD the night or the afternoon that he was let out of jail. And he said, "That bitch, I'm never going to see her again. I've got a re-enlistment leave, a furlough coming up, and I'm going, and I'm never going to see her again." I'll never forget his name, Sergeant Vanderberg. About 2 months later, my wife and I are driving through the island and on a dirt road, and who do we see walking down the road, arm in arm, cuddly, but Vanderberg and his wife. Understood.
Was there another time that there was a sergeant who got drunk and was shooting up the post with a .45 caliber pistol?
No.
When you got back to Brooklyn, what happened to all your military gear?
My military gear?
Yeah, your uniforms and everything.
I had a 1936 business coupe, which we drove up from Moultrie to my mother's house in Brooklyn. And we parked the car. We had so much stuff, we had to tie the trunk down. We couldn't lock it. And all the way up here, every time we stopped someplace, we opened the trunk, took the bags out, and then locked the thing, and took the bags into the motel. But when we got to my mother's house, we were so anxious to see the parents that we ran in for a minute. Then I ran out to get the luggage, and the ropes were cut, and 2 bags were missing. And 1 bag was all my uniforms. Almost all my uniforms, except maybe the uniform I had on. And my wife had a lot of clothes gone too. But we had 2 bags of silver in the trunk, and they were in the back, so they didn't get that. So we got the detective there, and he said, what was in the suitcases? And my wife started telling us. And the detective says, you couldn't have gotten in all that stuff in one suitcase. And my wife said, if you were an Army wife and moved from post to post, you would learn how to pack. He shut up.
How was it living as a married officer on some of those posts?
Lovely, great. We had a beautiful house on Fort Moultrie. Big, big house. Living room, full dining room, big den, butler's pantry, big kitchen, maid's quarters, and 3 bedrooms upstairs. Screened-in porch around 2 sides of the house on 1st and 2nd floors. This was an uncommissioned officer's house in the peacetime. It was officer country during the war. Beautiful homes. And nice officers' club, a nice pool. We even had a golf course on the post. Oh, it was easy living.
When you think back after all these years, does something in particular stand out in your memory about the time you were in the Army during World War II?
Something particular. No. I think the thing that I remember the most is that as a reservist after the war, I had to take a physical every year or every 2 years. I forget what it was. And I remember this doctor examining my eyes, and he says, I can't make you full duty. He says, I've got to put you limited duty. Wasn't that what you were during the war? I said, no, I was full duty. Oh, he says, well, if your eyes were good enough for the war, I guess they're good enough for peacetime, so full duty. I love the logic.
Any regrets about the time you spent in the service?
No.
Anything you're particularly proud of?
I'm proud of the work we did with the Air Sea Rescue. And at Fort Moultrie these days, they have a movie showing the beginning of the fort and whatnot, and they make mention of the fact that one of the first, well, it wasn't the first, but they said it was one of the first joint Navy-Army operations was Fort Monroe, and they were talking about my 6 sailors in my outfit.
Anything you'd like to add? We're coming down to the end of the tape.
Can't think of anything.